Welcome to Shelf Life from the Virginia Festival of the Book. I'm Erin Donovan of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thank you for joining us. A couple of notes before I hand the program over to our speakers. Please share your questions using the Q&A tab. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the closed captions tab at the bottom of your window. If you haven't already read today's book, we hope that you will. For details about how to buy it from a local bookseller or check out a copy from your local library, you can visit vabook.org, where you can explore the schedule of upcoming programs and also watch past events. While you're there, please consider making a donation to support the festival's ongoing work at vabook.org/give. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Samantha Rosenthal, she/they, author of Living Queer History, is Associate Professor of History and Coordinator of the Public History Concentration at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia. She is the author of 2 books, Living Queer History, Remembrance and Belonging in a Southern City, and Beyond Hawaii, Native Labor and the Pacific World. Rosenthal is also co-founder of the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ+ History Project, a nationally recognized queer public history initiative. Their work has received recognition from the National Council on Public History, the Oral History Association, the Committee on LGBT History, the American Society for Environmental History, and the Working Class Studies Association. Sarah Calise, she/they, is a public historian dedicated to connecting people with their past and preserving important records through digital, written, and verbal storytelling. She currently cares for the political and regional collections at MTSU's Albert Gore Research Center. In 2021, she founded the organization and digital portal called Nashville Queer History, whose mission is to research and share the LGBTQ+ history of Middle Tennessee in hopes of inspiring local activism, education, and inclusion. Her forthcoming book with Vanderbilt University Press will explore stories from Nashville's queer past from the 1920s to the modern day. Thank you both for joining us, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to everyone for being with us today. I'm excited to be joined in conversation with Samantha to discuss her amazing book that I devoured over the past week. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Samantha because she would like to start with a reading.
Great, thanks for having me, and hello to everybody watching. I'm going to read a little passage from chapter 2 of the book, which I think summarizes at best the best summary that I have in the book of what I mean by living queer history. I believe that queer history is a living practice and that it lives on in spaces of remembrance and belonging. When I walk Roanoke's paved streets and dirt alleyways today, I encounter the remnants, some might even say the queer ghosts, of an almost forgotten past. The work of queer public history is to make and remake these spaces of queer historical consciousness, to foster a renewed sense of togetherness and queer belonging around a shared understanding of the past. Our engagement with local histories also opens up new worlds of possibility for our collective future, for who we might become and how we might live together in the city as queer and trans people. For this work is not just about historical research, interpretation, and preservation. It's also about surviving the current moment and organizing for our well-being. I hope to found this project because I had a personal wish to fulfill. I wanted to find my people, a queer and trans community in Southwest Virginia. I thought I could use queer public history as a way to find other queers, make new friends, and build community. I didn't realize that I would also fall in love with another project leader. And that love story is kind of a thread through the book. In the years since our founding, we've established a new community here. We are friends, some of us are lovers. We are collaborators, sometimes across great differences and disparities of age, race, class, gender, and sexuality. In rallying people around the celebration of queer history, we make space for LGBTQ people in the present. by making space for LGBTQ history, we seek not just to rescue the past, but to create present and future spaces for our own survival. We make space for queer people just to be. This is what I believe queer public history work can do. Not just the commemoration and memorialization of queer pasts, but the reclamation of historically queer spaces and ways of being in space together. I want us to be our beautiful selves. I want us to love our neighborhood. I want us to gallivant around downtown in heels and sequins if that's what you want to do. I do not want us to fall victim to displacement, assimilation, or erasure.
That was beautiful. Thank you. I wanted to start off with, for those who have not been able to read the book yet, if you could just briefly summarize what the book is about and what you want the readers to take away from it.
Yeah, so this is a book that does several things at once. At least that was my intention in writing it. It's part history, part theory, and part memoir. So the history part looks at the history of Roanoke, Virginia, and the surrounding area, where I have lived since the mid-2010s, and where we have had this community-based queer history project for the past 7 years, documenting and interpreting histories of queer life in Southwest Virginia. So there is no book that exists about queer history in this region of the country, about Southwest Virginia. So I felt compelled to write up, much as you are doing, to write up the history that we've discovered through this community process. But secondly, it's also a book of historical theory in that the book is premised on questioning how we do history. What does it mean to do queer history? Who gets to do it? How do we decide what stories to tell and which ones not to tell? What are the politics of doing queer history in a small community in terms of who's sitting at the table and whose voices are heard and whose voices are not heard? So I'm thinking about what it is to be a historian, which I have a PhD in history, but everyone else involved in this project, which is now maybe 300 people at this point over the past 7 years, come at being a historian and doing queer history from so many different backgrounds and interests. And so it's sort of an exploration of why queer people are interested in history and how do queer people think about the past and how can we work together to shape the way we tell stories about the past to make that historical storytelling more just and more diverse and more liberatory. And finally, the memoir, I wasn't sure that was going to be part of the book, but in writing the book, I realized that I have also been so shaped by doing queer history. I came out just a year before we started this project, and later started transitioning and came out as a trans woman. In the course of doing the project and working with trans elders and realizing that this history was providing space for me to discover a lot about myself. So the third aspect of the book looks at the interpersonal relationships formed through queer history, such as friendships and lovers, but also looks at the personal journey of how doing queer history reshapes how we think about our own queerness.
Yeah, I definitely related to that part in particular when I was reading it, thinking about my own work doing Nashville's queer history. I think it's some historians, say, oh, we have to be objective. But as you discussed in the book, history is written by certain people. Often that can be certain people in power, and that determines like what historical narratives that we end up remembering. And I think so, we're all biased when we do historical work, and
Right.
it's just like natural to read queer history and think about your own journey. So I really appreciate the vulnerability that you brought to the book in discussing your own path and your own journey. It really enriches the narrative of the book. speaking of which stories get to be saved and preserved or told, is there one queer history from Roanoke that maybe didn't make it into the book, or one that did, and you like fought for it to be in there?
Thankfully, I didn't have to fight for anything to be in there because I had a great editor at UNC Press. So shout out to Brandon. But so we didn't have any fights over what went in and what didn't. And I had full control over the language and terms I was going to use too, which was really, really important in doing queer history, is what language we use. But so much is not in there. So when I've talked about this book with audiences, one question I get a lot is about the role of religion and Christianity, because we're here in the Bible Belt and we're like an hour down the road from Lynchburg, which is historically Jerry Falwell's base and the moral majority. So there's huge anti-gay histories, right? Histories of the anti-gay movement rooted here where I live that are more well known than the histories of gay folks. But there's not a lot of religion in the book because although we have so many of those stories in our project, in the oral history interviews, but because the book was very focused on looking at kind of urban spaces and how we make and remake and fight over spaces of queer belonging and spaces of queer historicity, like historical sites, that didn't come up as much. So I think that if there was a companion volume to Living Queer History, I think it would be very fascinating to mine the archives and oral histories that we've built over the past 7 years to really think about just the beautiful complexity of queer people's relationships with the church, the church, that's how people say it around here, right? The church.
Right.
But with Christianity. And I think the other thing that is not in the book, but I could be in a companion volume that I'm not going to write, but someone could, would look at relationships, would look at love and relationships and homemaking and that kind of thing. I look at my relationships, but there's not a lot in the book about dating and love. There's a lot about sex, but not a lot about love. And I think that, those stories are very rich in the oral histories, but didn't make the book.
Yeah. Yeah, we get a lot of, being Nashville, also part of the Bible Belt, religion comes up so much in the queer history here too. So yeah, I get it. Speaking of oral histories, that is a hugely important tool and methodology that you talk about in the book. Can you explain why is oral history so important, specifically for queer public history? And also, can you explain a little bit about the process of how you found participants? Because I think that can be difficult depending on what area you're in.
Absolutely. So yeah, like I said before, I have a PhD in history, and I think I can fairly say that most people who get PhDs in history, we are trained in a tradition that highly values, I would say overemphasizes the value of text. It's a very text-based practice. And we are taught to believe that written text has some kind of epistemological superiority to other kinds of sources like objects and oral stories and so on. But as public historians, you and I know that, texts they can tell some stories, but they don't tell every story. And they can really be hard to base interpretation on at the local level and in dealing with queer and trans communities in which we've lived through centuries of history in which leaving evidence of our identities was dangerous, right? To create textual sources was to create an archive of our criminality. And here in Virginia, up until less than 20 years ago, when sodomy laws were repealed by the Supreme Court. Same in Tennessee. So, I've never used that phrase before, but I'm going to keep that, the archive of criminality. But yeah, so when you look, so we do have an archive that we've created as part of this project, and I think that archive creation is really an important part of doing local queer history, because a lot of our local and regional archives and institutions before doing this, we've done this work, did not collect and or the queer community did not trust to hand over newsletters and flyers. And we have activist meeting minutes from the 80s. We have newsletters back to 1971 published in Roanoke. All kinds of amazing items. We have 5 big boxes in the archives of materials. But if you just did this history based on what we've collected in 7 years, it would be very white. It would be very cisgender. It would be very middle class, very professional class. And so we'd have a story about white, cis, gay men and lesbians of some matter of privilege. And we would not have really any stories, because I've read through all these newsletters 50 years ago. We would not have really any stories about trans and gender nonconforming people, about queer people of color, about sex workers. And if you read Living Queer History, my book really tries to center trans people and sex workers and queer people of color. So the way to do that then is that we have to create a new archive that we try to not make unduly influenced by the racism and sexism and classism of the queer past. And so oral history is a way to find unwritten stories. And we messed up a lot at first, which I think we can talk about later, in terms of who we reached out to and how we did the oral histories, in that we basically replicated some of those patterns of preferencing white, cis, gay men and lesbians. But over time, we've created an oral history collection that now has over 50 interviews. They're usually about an hour long, that prioritizes doing interviews with trans and non-binary people and Black LGBTQ people in particular, and sex workers, and with youth too. We initially privileged interviewing elders because we thought that's what oral history is. And we've actually extended that now to doing interviews with people down to their 20s. We haven't gone younger than that. But.
Oh, great. Yeah, I've definitely been prioritizing the elders too, because we're losing so many of them so fast, you know. And then there's the whole generation, of course, that doesn't even exist because of the AIDS epidemic. So,
Right.
But yeah, I think interviewing the younger crowd gets them interested too in the history and helping out with documenting what's going on now so that we have that for the future.
Right.
There is a great question that came in from the audience from Philip. Dr. Rosenthal, could you elaborate on your process of using public history to commemorate this living history? I read your 2017 article in which you mentioned that in which you mentioned the development of a tour. How did you do that for spaces that are no longer physically there?
Yeah, that article about our bar crawl is, in many ways, it's retold, but it's still in the book. In chapter 2 of the book centers around the bar crawl, which for everyone's benefit, this is an event we started in the first year of the project, where we discovered in one of the old gay newsletters a map of gay bars in downtown Roanoke with 5 bars on it. And this is at a time I had moved here to Roanoke, and there's one explicit gay bar in Roanoke. I was like, there used to be 5 within walking distance. And so some of my students at Roanoke College and I were talking about this map, and we came up with the idea of like, wouldn't it be cool to do a bar crawl where we go to the sites of each of those former gay bars and we get a drink either there, if it's still around, which some of them are straight bars now, so it has that guerrilla gay bar element, or we get a drink nearby because like one is a church and like one is like luxury apartments and all kinds of stuff. And throughout the night we go from historic gay bar to gay bar and end at the Park, which was not on the map, but is our one gay nightclub that's still around, which opened in 1978. So it's a very historic gay nightclub. And we would end there. And we read from the oral histories at each site. Before we go in, we stand outside and we give life to the voices of elders who remember going to that site back in 1977 or 1982 and talking about what it was like to be there. Now, there's one site on that tour that the building is demolished. It was demolished. It was the very first gay bar in Southwest Virginia, opened in the 50s, and it was demolished around 1990. Uh, there was a grassy field there for a long time, and now they're building an animal hospital on the site. And we don't go there. So just to answer the question about like how do we deal with the missing, the ghosts of the queer history, we don't go to that site. It's also on the margins of downtown. But we do go to the site that is a kind of church. We do go to the straight bars, and we have been barred at the door from some of them from going in because we had too many very queer looking people. And I write about those encounters in the book. So, so that's one thing. But then we also do historic walking tours, traditional walking tours, which we've offered once a month since 2016. For 6 years now, we have 3 different neighborhoods in Roanoke that we offer tours in because we have that many sites and materials to cover. Each tour is 2 hours. They're always free, and we do them for private groups for free, also never charge a dime. And it's all local queer people who are the walking tour guides. They're not students. They don't have history degrees. They're just queer people who want to be our guides. And I work with them we work collectively to create the scripts and refine the scripts. And I train them to give the tours. And on those tours, sometimes we'll point out something that's we can't visualize, that's not there anymore. But for the most part, in Roanoke, I'd be curious about Nashville too, but for the most part, the stories we have unfolded in an infrastructure that's still there. One of our tours focuses specifically on gentrification as a threat to, and which is a big theme in my book too, as a threat to the landscape of queer history. But it's interesting because some of these buildings are turning into lofts or into breweries and that kind of thing. But there's still something there that we can see. And I think that just from a public history point of view, it is quite evocative when there is a building or a park or something there to talk about. For sex work, it's often just looking at a street corner, and the street corner is still a street corner. But sometimes there's nothing there, and we might be able to print up a photograph of what it used to look like to hand around.
Yeah, Nashville's a bit different. Philip is actually works with me with Nashville Queer History. So I think what he was hinting at is that Nashville really loves to tear down things and build on top of it. So I could probably count on 2 hands, maybe less than that, of how many physical buildings still exist where something queer was. Queer bar, queer organization. So we kind of have a difficult time figuring out how do we give proper memorialization to this space that you can't even physically see anything anymore. Mm-hmm. So we've done stuff like story maps and finding old photos that we can then, this is what it was here, but now it's a completely different building, which I think speaks to something you talk about in the book. And it's really important. I'm going to suggest your book to the Center for Historic Preservation's professor at Middle Tennessee State, because I think you talk about the problem with the, requirements to get a building on the National Register and to get those historic protections. Can you talk about that a little bit? How traditional historic preservation actually hinders saving queer public history?
Yeah, great question. I think historic preservation is a really weird field, and that's not my field. But as a public historian, I work with preservationists, and there's been a lot of interesting writing about queer historic preservation. There's some new volumes that were based on the NPS LGBTQ America study that came out in 2016. There's some now printed volumes of updated essays from that really think about what does it look like to preserve queer history in the landscape But I have to say that even those efforts that have been done tend to rely on a very traditional model of what preservation is. And I think that we have to queer historic preservation. That is, we can't rely on the kind of straight cis model, white. I mean, the preservation is historically classist and racist also. We can't rely on the same models to think about how we preserve the queer past. So, for example, our project, we are aware of the historic nomination process to get a building or neighborhood or whatever nominated for historic landmark status. And as you are hinting at, and as I talk about in the book, one of the rules around that is the 50-year rule, that generally, and there are ways to make exceptions for it, but generally that a building can't be landmarked as historically significant until at least 50 years have passed. So, for example, we've been seeing in a lot of our communities over the past decade or so, a lot of documentation of civil rights era histories because we've gotten past that 50-year mark. But the Stonewall Uprising was 1969. And so it's just 3 years ago that became 50 years. And when you look in our Southern communities, sometimes there was a bit of a time lag. Roanoke's gay liberation movement began in 71. So it was just last year that we would have made 50 years. So we actually pursued with Richmond, with the Commonwealth of Virginia, the idea of putting up a historical plaque at the Trade Winds, which was that first ever gay bar that was now a grassy field. We thought, well, there's nothing there as a mnemonic to remind people that queer bar history, as far as we know, began on this corner. We worked with the Department of Historic Resources in Richmond and mocked up a plaque, and we had media attention around it. We were going to raise money because not everyone knows, but at least in Virginia, you have to pay for the plaques. The community has to pay, and it's thousands of dollars. We got that far. We got quite far in the process. And then members of our project started to hit the brakes and say, wait, if we're raising $2,000, do we really want to put a plaque up? Or can we give that money to young, poor trans people who need that for transition-related care? And what is a better public history practice of caring for queer history and queer community? Or can we give that money to the Black queer organization getting off the ground in our community where there's never been a Black queer organization? So we just pulled the plug. We didn't do it. And in the intro to the book, I say that I theorize that I think historic plaques don't really do anything for the future of queer community. Rainbow crosswalks don't do anything for our community. As I've said many times to people, if you paint a rainbow crosswalk at a historically gay intersection, that doesn't mean I can go stand in the middle of it and not get hit by a car. It's not creating spaces where we can be safe, spaces of belonging, new spaces of community building that allow us to, on a social, interpersonal, cultural, political, community level, to carry on the legacies of our past. Because if we're not creating spaces that are lived in, the living queer history of my book, which historic preservation generally does not do that. And it gives tax breaks to the developers who turn these gay buildings into condos and lofts, which are not affordable for poor, queer, and trans people. But if we can focus on creating spaces where we can build a community of the future, I think that's the best way to actually carry on the queer history of community organizing for the past 50 years here. So that's my take on historic preservation.
Yes, that was a powerful story of how you all pulled the plug on the plaque. I love that. I think there's probably some public historians maybe watching that were shocked by that. And I hope so. Like, hope it makes us rethink what we're actually doing as public historians and what's best for the community. Wow. Yeah, I love that. I think we can kind of relate that to, you talk about the whiteness of queer history, and then in particular at the start of the Southwest Virginia LGBTQ plus history project, how that kind of lent itself more towards covering white cis gay male history. Can you talk about how you've tried to correct this in the project and maybe what's failed, what's worked?
Sure. So, first of all, I think that it's long been true and still is that when people think LGBTQ or think queer or think gay, that there's a kind of racial myopia there or blindness around that challenges the whiteness of those constructions. I mean, I think, and there's a great essay by Alan Berube, who's like one of the foundational queer public historians, called why gay, something like how gay is white and why it stays white, which is a great reading for folks who are just starting to think about the whiteness of queerness, which is the title of my chapter about whiteness and about race in doing this work. So when I moved to Roanoke in 2015, and looked around at the queer landscape, the organizations, the bars, the people, the queer leaders in the community, is all white gay men that were really like leading these organizations. And when we started our project, it was the same because I was a white cis man. And personally, I really, when I came out as queer in 2014, right before I moved down here, as I say in the book, I came out as queer, but I didn't come out as white, which is to say that I didn't think that that was part of the process of being a queer person or coming out as a trans person, was to interrogate how my whiteness shapes my experience. Now, as a trans woman in the world, it's crystal clear to me so often that my safety and survival and my well-being is highly shaped by being a white woman and not being a trans woman of color. It's clear that my transness is a white experience. So that is all to say that race remains a big issue in queer communities. Now, in Nashville or in Roanoke, we live with the legacies of slavery and the legacies of Jim Crow and redlining, etc. And Roanoke is a highly segregated city still, that the neighborhoods tend to still demographically map onto the Jim Crow era of explicit segregation. The gay neighborhood in Roanoke, where I live, was an all-white neighborhood. And when it became gay in the early 70s, the 1970 census, it was still 99% white. This is the time of desegregation. So, part of the job in the book is I'm trying to show that we can't do queer history, and this is true across the country, but it has some special parameters in the South. We can't do this history without thinking about it, how it's a racialized story, and that segregation and desegregation and Jim Crow and redlining and racism within the queer community, within our bars and organizations that kept out queer people of color, that this is something that we have to grapple with. All right, so that is all to say that this is an ongoing problem. How do we do that work? Well, as I talk about in that chapter, we began the project, the we of the project was overwhelmingly white gay men at first. The elders who first put their hands up and said, I want to be interviewed, I have stuff to donate. And this is nothing against them, but we can think about it psychologically. The people who did that were white, cis, gay men who are middle class, etc. They saw themselves as queer history. They felt identification with what that narrative is, the major benchmarks of that story. But lesbians and trans people and queer people of color did not show up at first. And we had to do explicit outreach, both to build the archives and oral histories, but also to transform our project internally, knowing that it was not a just and ethical position from which to work, to be a group of mostly white cis gay men. So as I talk about in the book, we became an army of women in the second, third years. Suddenly all the men kind of pulled out of the project, and all these young queer women became involved. Trans people became involved just as I was also coming out as trans and transitioning. It affected the stories we told. It affected the things we were looking for, and the way we moved through the cityscape was affected by who was at the meetings and who was making decisions and what kind of histories we were most interested in. But we were still very, very white. And so the first step that worked was to bring on one of the most visible Black queer leaders in our community, who was not doing queer history work at the time, but was doing other things, as a leader in our project, to bring him in. He became a kind of broker with a Black queer community that we were not intersecting with in our highly segregated city, in our segregated queer community here. So we were able to do interviews and move the project forward a little bit, but we still realized that that was very tokenizing and it wasn't fundamentally shifting power. Then we were applying for grants, which, you know, I won't get into the whole project relationship with money, which is interesting, and I talk about in the book. We don't have a budget and we don't have a treasurer. But we were able to get grants from the Campaign for Southern Equality, which is a Southern queer activist organization, to pay young Black queer people to become trained, to train them in oral history. And then they went out and did interviews with Black queer elders. So in that way, we were able to cede some of the authority and the power over what was going on and give funding to Black queer people to do this work. But then, you know, kind of, I would say the next stage and the one we're in now, which has really emerged a lot in the post-George Floyd uprising period, which is past, I finished the book. I finished writing the draft of the book in 2020. So this is not so much in the book. But that Black queer leader who was involved with us from 2016 onwards, he then helped to create a ballroom house here in Roanoke, where we did not have a history of a ballroom house, and create an explicitly Black queer community organization. So that then, come summer of 2020, when we were having lots of meetings as a community about how the queer community is responding to the George Floyd uprising, we were able to make commitments at that time that, okay, we're going to, whenever we get money, we get resources, when we get platforming, such as like media requests, et cetera, we are going to work with this Black queer organization here to make sure that Black queer people are at the forefront of speaking about queer life in Roanoke, that they're getting funds, that we're funneling funds into Black queer communities' hands to do community organizing, where for the past 50 years, there was no explicit Black queer space or group. So that's about where we are right now. And our project is still majority white, but we do have queer people of color who are longtime leaders who are still involved. So it's been an interesting process of continual reflection. And I think that it's ongoing work in all of our communities to continue to decenter sort of white supremacy within LGBTQ spaces.
Yes, definitely 100%. For anyone watching who's either doing local queer history or is a public historian themselves, the one thing I really love about your book is that you're not just talking about the successes, you talk about the failures, and it's really, there's good lessons in there for all public historians to learn of where you've succeeded and where you failed and what challenges you have seen. And so it's a really practical book in that sense. It's got good applications for doing queer public history work. We are coming towards the end, so I will, if anyone in the audience has a question, this is your chance. If not, then I will, let's end on a happier note, perhaps, and talk about how important is it for you to document queer joy in the world, especially as, you know, we're historians, so we see the cycles come and go of oppression against our community. And it's kind of ticked up a bit in the South with local and state governments. So yeah, what's the importance of documenting queer joy for the project?
I think that queer joy and trans joy is really, it's really at the heart of the work we do. You know, I described the bar crawl, for example. So we're back from COVID. I mean, we're not back overall as a pandemic, just to point out, but we decided that we could safely do the bar crawl again after 3 years, and did it. And we did one last month, and about 25, LGBTQ plus people, mostly young people in their 20s, came out for the evening, and we marched through town looking very gay and drinking and building community, meeting each other. I think people probably even met and like will go on dates and stuff. So it's like the project is a matchmaking service. But it was such a joyful time, and it's interesting. In the book, I do think about this. I write about the question of queer historical reenactment. Like, I like thinking about the bar crawl as a reenactment of a night out in 1978, of visiting those spots that were in that circuit of bars. But I do think about, are we having fun at the expense of how dangerous it may have been to actually do that bar crawl in 1978 with the original spaces? And so I give some examples in that chapter of other reenactments we've done, and some we didn't do, but considered, such as there were some reenactments based on trans sex work histories, which are really central in the book, that we thought through, but then realized we can't do these because, we thought it would be fun to do them in that we were taking over spaces that had been reclaimed by the city from spaces of trans belonging and sex work. But to go back into those spaces today and not risk arrest in the same ways and not risk violence in the same ways felt really inappropriate. And that, many of us are trans, but none of us are out as sex workers ourselves. We felt like, okay, that's not right. So I think that our project, we're constantly trying to do activist and social activities that bring people out into space together to create new spaces of belonging that are rooted in the past. But yeah, I do think we need to be mindful of how, when we walk those footsteps and open that bar door again today, we cannot recapture the same experiences of the time. And I think we should be easy on ourselves knowing that we cannot. And so we need not feel glum about it. We should feel joy at finding each other in 2022. We should find joy in knowing that we belong, that generations of people have come before us, and we are in communion with that. We should find joy in our transgenerational spaces that we build through the project to bring people from different time periods together. But it is hard, as you have said, to grapple with the AIDS crisis, to grapple with sex work histories, the histories of racism, etc. So I think that it's Pride Month, and I often complain about Pride Month because I think that pride, it's an interesting term, but there's so many other terms we could also use to talk about our experience as queer people. Pride is unduly celebratory. Pride is, and it's great. We should have joy, like you say, but it's not a basis upon which to think about the queer past. We need joy and sorrow. We need celebration and grief. And I think a good queer public history project makes spaces for all of those emotions and brings people together to be able to feel those things. And I hope that we've, through all of the different things that we do, have been able to get queer people in touch with all of those different emotional ways of engaging with the past. But happy Pride Month, yes to queer joy.
Beautiful. Of course, in the last minute, like 5
Great.
great questions came in.
I will give short answers.
Would you also maybe be willing to like share an email or something? I don't know. Some of them are probably going to be long answers.
Okay, you choose.
But a quick one is there a public website where your oral history interviews are available to listen to?
Yeah, I can drop that in the chat. So let me get that and you can ask another one.
Another quick one would be from Peter, who's very impressed with your work in Roanoke. Are there other local LGBTQ history organizations in other Virginia cities that you know of?
Yes, absolutely. Virginia, we even had a coalition at one point of all of these projects to make sure, actually to explore if we could share. The dream was to maybe get a grant that we could create a website that you could search through all of the projects to get your Virginia queer history. We're not meeting and we're not doing that anymore, but because we don't have the bandwidth, right? Doing community history means not having the bandwidth for anything, and being constantly burnt out. That's like queer joy, and then the queer burnout is the second most common feeling. But
I can concur.
But yeah, absolutely. Let me list some of them. So my friend Kathleen Rhodes at ODU, Old Dominion University, helped to found the Tidewater Queer History Project, which looks at histories in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Tidewater region. Really cool stuff. They've done a walking tour, they've done video interviews, etc. They've digitized the newsletter out there, which was one of the longest running gay newsletters. My friends at William and Mary, Lisa Meyer and Jay Watkins, have been working on the LGBTIQ research project there for the past at least 6-7 years, and doing a lot of documentation around Richmond and the Richmond area. There are also community historians like Beth Marshak in Richmond, who wrote a lovely little book, which you can get online about. It's called Gay and Lesbian Richmond. So there's a long history of documentation in Richmond. Nova, Northern Virginia, is a kind of interesting place because so much of it gets subsumed into DC, because if you're in Northern Virginia, you went to DC. But there are people there working with like the Rainbow History Project in DC to tell Northern Virginia stories as well. Virginia Tech, which is down the road here in Appalachia from us, had an LGBTQ oral history project for many years, focused on Virginia Tech's history and that Montgomery County. So there's a lot of projects. We're covering the whole Commonwealth, all of the regions. And you didn't ask, so I won't mention all of the Appalachian projects, but I feel like, I feel, Sarah, that you and I are on two ends of a region that is really doing amazing work grappling with queer and trans histories in Appalachia too.
Yes, definitely. I don't think I realized how many different like local queer history projects were happening in Tennessee until I started Nashville Queer History. And it's like the smallest of towns and the biggest of towns all have something going on. And like last year, all of a sudden, for the first time, a bunch of the cities that surround Nashville were holding their first Pride events. So it's like not just Nashville anymore. It's like all those smaller towns are celebrating their own unique story outside of Nashville as well. So yeah, it's been really wonderful to connect with everyone across the state and then across the South. So super excited that I got to do this discussion with you. I am going to wrap up because we are about 5 minutes over.
Oh, Sarah, y'all can absolutely keep going if you want, if you have the time. I know that we still have a few questions.
Yeah, I have the time.
I can go. Yeah, I thought we were going till 1, so we can. Yeah. Let's wrap it up.
Perfect. Let's
wrap up the question.
Yeah.
No more.
from Charlotte. This is a great one. What advice do you have for fresh out of high school teens who want to create social change and contribute to the queer impact? Would you recommend certain education paths?
Sure. I mean, I think that if such person wants to go to college, honestly, and I teach college, so I advise 18-year-olds, like first year students all the time. And I say, oh, you're interested in queer history or queer studies, like major in anything, honestly. Like at this point in your life, my major is in music from college, and I won't turn the camera around and play you my piano right over there. But I love music. But it, it my liberal arts degree serves me well as a historian. So being a queer historian is not a career path. I would just say in general, this is not something that people are not going to hire you to do queer history, but of course you could be a history teacher, a history professor. You can work in museums and historic sites and work in government. And I was paid for 6 years when I lived in New York City to be a walking tour guide. So if you live in a big enough city, you can make money doing that. I was a park ranger. I worked at a historic house. So I've done a lot of those kind of public history jobs. But I majored in music, as I said. So like, I do think that, there's no need to limit yourself as a teenager to what you are interested in. Study science, study humanities, do the social sciences, do art, do it all. Because we do need queer people in all of these fields. I keep telling queer people who have some interest in health and medicine to please become doctors, because as a trans person, I would love to have more providers and people making policy who are queer and trans. Okay, that said, also, you don't have to go to college to do queer history. In many of our southern towns and cities, there are queer organizations. And we, in our project in Roanoke and with the Roanoke Diversity Center, which is our LGBTQ community center, we've worked with several teens on this project who are in high school, who have been walking tour guides, who have worked in our archives and digitizing archives. We've had teens helped make a zine for our project when we launched a zine back in the day. There was a local zine, it was a zine club at a local high school. So I think that there are queer organizations that you can get involved with right now and say, I'm interested in queer history, and they will want your help. So that's my recommendation.
I love that. I've wanted to do a zine too for Nashville queer history. And I was thinking there's a local, Nashville has the Oasis Center, which is really our only LGBTQ community center, but it's for middle school and teens, and they do programming, and I wanted to partner with them. So that's on the future docket for sure. Philip's question very much ties into what you just said, so I might skip it, but it says, what are some strategies you suggest for engaging the queer youth in a southern city? And I think you mentioned some, finding those organizations or the high school clubs and just reaching out and asking if they want to partner with you, right?
Yeah, and the only other thing I'll say, the place where queer youth really show up in my book is chapter 4 about trans histories, because we did for many years this interactive theater workshop with middle school and high school age students. Now, keep in mind, in Virginia, and especially in places like Tennessee, we did not do this in public schools where teachers are going to get fired for doing something like that. I mean, that's just the reality. But we've been able to do this this trans history theater workshop where the students ultimately are creating their own skits based on oral history materials. We've done it at a private high school in Roanoke, and we did it for several years at the LGBTQ summer camp we have here in Southwest Virginia, which is also to let people know if they're anywhere near Roanoke that we have a LGBTQ summer camp, a sleepaway camp that it's late June, so there's still time to register for this year, but which is an amazing place where I've been a counselor for the past 5-6 years. And we've done queer history workshops with youth as young as 10, 11 years old there, to amazing effect. And I write in the book about some of the stories of the skits that the young people put together for that workshop.
That's so great. I love that idea of a sleepaway camp. That's beautiful. And then finally, one last question from Bella. I'm a grad student studying queer history and data science, and I'm trying to determine what stories or experiences could best benefit from being treated through this lens. Do you have any recommendations, especially taking into account what you said about the lack of older queer archives due to criminalization?
I'm assuming the lens, you mean the data science?
I think so too, yeah.
Yeah, so, digital history and digital humanities is a really, really important field. And, it's a big part of public history work. My last chapter is called Digital Queers, and I really grapple with the history of how LGBTQ people have engaged with the internet and think about the kind of digital versus analog ways of today, of how we might think historically and engage in queer paths. So, I think a general caveat is that digital tools, digital presentation tools of these histories are not going to reach everyone, right? And we have found in our project, as every public history project ever has found, that sometimes the digital tools we use just don't work for elders who we're working with. We have to physically go over to their homes and meet and so on. So, for example, when we created our archives, we immediately created a form. We worked with Roanoke College's IT to create an upload form for born digital contributions. Born digital meaning things that were made, they weren't a piece of paper. They began as a digital object, like a digital picture or a digital flyer, etc. And we created this form and we advertised it all over, and we created policies about what to do with stuff that comes through the form. And in 7 years, not a single person has ever uploaded anything through it, which I think is a great lesson about, it's not like you build it and they will come from the field of dreams. We have to use the technologies and create the kind of processes and products that fit our communities that we're working with. Now, working with queer youth, we have an Instagram page, we have Facebook, we have a podcast now. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all over. So I think using multiple different kind of tools, analog and digital, is the best way to work transgenerationally, intergenerationally, which is one of the key aspects, I think, of queer public history, is working across those generational divides between the people who say, don't use the term queer, that's offensive to me, and the people who say, I am queer, which is one of the big generational divides. So I guess unfortunately, my answer to you, I think, is to just, I'm thinking about, and in the book, thinking about all the implications of the digital. And I think it's really important work, and digital archives is stuff we are still digitizing our analog archives. We're making those newsletters accessible to the world. We're working with JSTOR now, so you can search on JSTOR for all of our newsletters, and using OCR, optical character recognition, so that you can word search in the newsletters for the words that were printed there back in 1975. So there's lots of cool technologies that we can use to make this history more accessible. And we should think about how technology is also a kind of practice that has a lot of different meanings within queer community.
That's excellent. I am going to wrap things up now, but I wanted to give you, Samantha, the last word if you wanted to wrap up your thoughts for today for the audience.
Nope, this was so much fun. Thanks for having me.
All right, perfect. So thank you to Samantha and to everyone who tuned in. Please buy Living Queer History. It is so good. From your local bookseller preferably, or through the link that was in the chat earlier. You can explore upcoming virtual events from the Virginia Festival of the Book at vabook.org. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.